Hello, everyone. Yes, so I'm Ben Mundy. I'm the Fab Lab Plymouth manager. Well, my background is been in digital manufacturing for about the last 17 years or so. And originally a sculptor, moving into furniture design and manufacturing, and then teaching that and all sorts of digital manufacturing at universities and working commercially for about the last 17 years. About 3 years ago, plus, I took over the managing at Fab Lab Plymouth at PCA. I'm sure you already know, but for those that don't, Fab Lab Plymouth's got 8 different 3D printers, 3 different types of 3D printing, lots of CNC machines, so cutting things out from materials, water jet cutters, laser jet cutters, all of that kind of good stuff. But underpinning all of that is the software that you need to access or need to have some understanding of to access those machines. And one of the pieces of software we use a lot is Fusion 360 by Autodesk. We use it because it's really good quality, very comprehensive program, but it's fundamentally free. It's free to students and it's free to hobbyists and startups. So it's good value and very feature packed. As Ellie said, we're going to look at the Sculpt environment today in Fusion 360. And Ellie's already mentioned what it's good for, really. It allows you, as Ellie said, to work much more sort of fluidly, creatively, a bit like working with clay in some ways on screen. Obviously, you don't have the tactile feedback through your hands, but you push and pull and twist and stretch a three-dimensional object in Fusion 360. The reason for this is that quite quickly you can create really quite complex forms, which would be much harder to do using the normal sort of extrude and revolve functions that you might have already experienced in Fusion. And it enables you to be a bit more experimental with the kind of shapes that you're trying to make. So it's really quite different way of working to the rest of Fusion, but it does also work with other elements of Fusion. So you can create a Sculpt form within the Sculpt environment and then go into different workspaces in Fusion and use that Sculpt form there and do other things to it using those other techniques. So the applications for the Sculpt function, they're all sorts, really. Sometimes it's just a quick way of modeling something and it's the most efficient way. But if you're coming from a background of craft work or working with your hands, it might be a more intuitive way of working than working with the sort of the sketches and dimensions and constraints of the standard design space within Fusion. So it's particularly good for people from a craft background, I'd say, or sculptural background, obviously, anyone that's wanting to explore that world digitally. So I think what we'll do is I'll present my screen and we'll just jump straight into it, I think, really, and I'll show you around. Just do that. So can everyone see a screen of Fusion? It seems to be flashing at the moment, but it did that this morning and then it stopped.
Yeah, it's flashing. We can see it.
I don't know why it's doing that.
That's good now.
Right. I don't know why it did that. It did that this morning as well. It seems to have sorted itself out. So hopefully we can see that we've got Fusion open. I've just got an example of something that was created purely in the Sculpt environment in Fusion. So this was a little sort of raku pinch pot. I think my daughter made on a raku taster course a few years ago, and it's hanging around the house. And I thought it was quite a good example of how something that's been obviously made by your hands can also be modeled up in Fusion. So this is just a test sort of demonstration of how to create something like that in Fusion. Before we get stuck into how I did that, so I think what it's worth doing is obviously showing you how to get into the Sculpt environment and just some of the basic tools you'll find in there before we start looking at this main example. So I'm just going to quickly open up a new design within Fusion, and we'll have a blank piece of paper, basically. So we're at the top level of Fusion, and we're in the design workspace. That's where the Sculpt environment sits. So it's in amongst all your other standard 3D modeling tools, things like your extrude, revolve, those kind of standard functions. You can tell it's the Sculpt function because it's the only purple icon that's in the toolbar, and it's kind of this. It looks like an exploding purple blob, basically. I'm not sure why they use that icon, but that's the create form or the Sculpt function, and that's what we're going to start working with. So when we open up a new design, this is what we'll find in Fusion. And I appreciate that. Hopefully, I think most of you have been on stage 1 or potentially stage 2 of the introduction to 3D. So what I'm not going to do is show you all around the interface of Fusion again, because hopefully you'll have seen that. But if there are any questions or you're not sure about anything, just pop them in the chat as we go along and I'll answer them. So in the main toolbar along here, we've got our create form button. It used to be called Sculpt in Fusion, and that's where I've got used to calling it. They've changed it to create form, but that's why I will sometimes flip between the words sculpt and form, but it's this area anyway. So I'm just going to press this button up here, and you can see that the toolbar has changed, and we're essentially now in this Sculpt function environment. We've got a different set of create options, and we've got a different set of modify options, okay, in the toolbar. If I just open up the create menu, what we have down here are a number of primitives, what are known as primitives. Primitives in 3D CAD are basically, they're like a starting form, sort of a preset form which you can use as a starting point and then modify from there. And working with this kind of modeling, that's quite a standard practice, really. And it's known as T-spline modeling. We can, however, extrude and revolve and sweep and loft in the form environment or the Sculpt environment in exactly the same way as we can in the normal design workspace. And so that's our create menu with a number of different types of primitives, and we'll have a closer look at those in a minute. Just briefly moving over to the modify menu, and this looks a bit complex when you first look at it, but there's lots of different ways of, once you've created some kind of Sculpt form, start modifying it and changing it into what you want it to be. And I'll touch on some of those in this session, but by no means all. It's quite a big sort of environment within Fusion. There's a lot to know about it, but we can have a look at some of those really useful modifying functions. So the first thing I'm going to do, just to show you how the Sculpt function works, is I'm going to use one of these primitives. So I've got the create menu here, and I'm going to create a box. The box function is also up here as this button as well. So I'm going to click on that. And you can see that what happens is that our origin comes up with the 3 planes, and we need to select a plane to start. We need to tell Fusion where we want to put our box. And I'm just going to click on one of these planes to start drawing my box. And when I hover over it with my cursor, the one that turns grey is the one I'm going to select. And it doesn't matter which one you select. I'm going to select the top bottom plane. So I'm going to click on that. And then, I don't know if you can see, but next to my cursor, I've got a little crosshairs now. And this is the midpoint of where we're going to start drawing the rectangle that makes the box. I'm just going to click on the origin point and click once more with my left button, my mouse, and this starts to drag out a rectangle. If you want to, at this point, you can add dimensions to the rectangle. I'm not going to bother. I'm going to work in a much more freeform way. So I'm just going to make some kind of rectangle and click with my left mouse button again. And once I do that, hey presto, we're presented with this kind of blobby type box, this kind of rounded off box, and this is our primitive. Okay, this is the shape we've got from pressing the box button. Now we've also got a dialog box over here on the right hand side, and what we can do, we can start to change things within this box. We can change dimensions if we want to. We can make it whatever dimension we want, and we can change the number of faces it has. But let's not focus on that too much at the moment. What I want to show you really is how you start being sort of sculptural with Fusion. So we've got our primitive here. I'm just going to put it around so you can see it. To start actually playing around with it and pushing and pulling and twisting and all of those kind of things, we're going to use the modify, the edit form button in the modify menu. It's the one right at the top of the menu, but it's also this button here as well. So that's the way we're going to select that. And I'm just going to click on that. Now we have this dialog box again over here, and there's lots of different ways we can select stuff, but we're going to ignore that just for a moment and just have a look at the box itself. Whilst I'm in the edit form function, I'm just going to click on one of these surfaces, and that selects that surface. And when you do that, this kind of rather complex looking modifier pops up. And what I'm going to do is really show you what this modifier does, because this is really core to using the sculpt function within Fusion and understanding this. And it's pretty straightforward once you start playing around with it. I'll just zoom in a bit so you can see the better. So this is the face that's been selected. Okay, and if I start moving around some of these handles on this modifier tool, you can see what happens hopefully. So this handle, this is an arrow pointing upwards. And if I click and hold down with my left mouse button and drag it up, you can see it drags up that surface. But it also drags the other surfaces in conjunction with it to some degree. And it kind of does this in a fluid motion. So you will always have a sort of a rounded, smooth form. And so obviously with this arrow, you can go up and you can go down, so you can depress and push into things, or you can lift them up. And then the other arrows do the same things in the other direction. So obviously this arrow is going to pull that direction or push it along that axis, the x-axis. And then finally, this arrow over here is going to do the same in the y-axis. So even just with using those three arrows, you can begin to see how quickly you can start to mold your shape into something other than just a box. So, so what happens if you want to move it in a direction other than in those three set directions? That's a bit limiting. So what we have are these little squares in between each arrow. If I move around, hopefully you can see, if we look at this tool, that these squares kind of sit between each of the arrows. And what these squares do is this arrow pulls in this direction, this arrow pulls in this direction, but this square will pull and push in both of those directions at the same time. Essentially on that plane, it will move it around along that plane. And it's the same for these two arrows, this one and this one. The square in between them moves in both of those directions at once. And the same for the final way as well. So those are the arrows and those are the squares. What else we can do is we can also rotate this face, okay? And we've got these arcs popping up here. And what we can do, we can just grab hold of one of these circles in the middle of one of these arcs and just start moving it around by holding down the left mouse button as you're moving it around, sort of like dragging it around its arc. And you can even set the degrees if you want to, or you can just move more or play with it more freely. And again, because we're working in 3 dimensions, we have 3 different rotator modifiers working in 3 different directions. So with one tool, we can move things in all 3 directions. We can rotate things in all 3 directions. But there's one more function that the modifier tool has, and that is we can also make this particular face larger or smaller in relation to the rest of the object. So we've got these little sort of lines around the edge of the rectangle, or sorry, the edge of the square here. And these basically will scale the face in that direction. So I can move that face up and down, or scale that face up and down, scale it backwards and forwards along that axis, or in both axes. We can do that the same for any of these modifiers, or any of these planes rather. We can scale it up in any of the 3 dimensions. And then finally, the last thing that we can do is scale up and down the whole thing, the whole face, by dragging this one backwards and forwards. So that's, again, just clicking on that and holding your left mouse button down and moving your mouse around slowly will scale that whole face up and down. I just noticed in the chat. Sorry, Ellie.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. We've got 2 questions, because I think 2 of the participants lost their connection for a bit, and they're wondering how you managed to create that that form. Can you take us through that again?
Yeah, absolutely, no problem at all. Let me just turn that one off and do it again. So to create that primitive box, that first form, we're going to go up to the Create menu, and we're going to select Box. Okay, and the same button also exists up in the toolbar. This one here. So either way. So once you click on that, you'll get basically the origin pop up, and it's asking you where you want to start drawing a box. And you need to select a plane onto which to draw a rectangle, which is the basis for drawing the box. It doesn't matter which plane you select. I'm going to select the top bottom one just by clicking on it when it's grey. And now, and it might be hard to see, but hopefully you can see there's a little crosshairs on the tip of the mouse, or the mouse cursor. And this is the center point of the rectangle we need to draw. So I'm just going, you can draw it anywhere. I'm going to draw mine on my origin. So I'm just going to click once, let go of the mouse button, and you move your mouse around and it will start dragging out a rectangle. At this point, if you wish, you can put some dimensions in, or you can not. It's entirely up to you. Once you're happy with the size of your box, you can click your left mouse button once more. And, beg your pardon. And we will have our box appear. Okay. And we have our box modifier dialog box over here. And I didn't show you this before, but seeing as we've just done it, I'll show you once again. We can change the dimensions of our box, but we can also create more faces in our box. At the moment, you can see the box is subdivided into different faces. We've got sort of 4 on the top and 4 on each side, and obviously 4 on the bottom. But we can add more. So we've got length faces, width faces, and height faces. So we can add as many as we like. And you can kind of see what happens as I enter the number 4 into each of those dialog boxes. We end up with, instead of 2 faces across the height of it, or the width of it, we've now got 1, 2, 3, 4. And it's entirely up to you how many of these that you want, basically. The more faces you put into your shape, the more detailed the shape can get. If you want a smoother, sort of more fluid shape, you might want fewer. And you can always remove them later on if you want to. I'm just going to take this back. I'm just going to leave it, something like that. So that's how a box is made, and it's the same for any of the other primitives as well. When you select any of these ways of making a primitive form, say we were going to create a cylinder, exactly the same thing. We need to choose a plane on which we're going to draw our cylinder. So again, I'm going to choose this plane, and we need a center point of that cylinder, and then we can drag that cylinder out by clicking once with your left click mouse and just moving your mouse around to the size you want it to be, and then clicking another time to actually create a cylinder. And then we can modify that cylinder just by dragging it up, making it bigger, like so, or inputting information into the cylinder dialog box. So for any of these primitives, it's the same kind of approach. You have to choose your primitive and decide where you want it to be in 3-dimensional space first, before Fusion can actually create it. So get rid of that one. So with the modifier tool, that's the core tool really that you're going to be using within the Sculpt environment. But there are other tools as well. And one thing I'm going to show you right at the outset is the symmetry tool. So obviously sometimes you want to create a form and it has no symmetry. It's a completely sort of organic object that might not have any symmetry. But a lot of the times things that we create do have some kind of symmetry. They're going to be same on the left-hand side as they are on the right-hand side. So Fusion's got a tool within it which can create lines of symmetry around any of the forms you've created in the Sculpt environment. And it means that it's very easy to create symmetrical objects. And how do we do that? Well, we can see we've got the create menu, we've got the modify menu. Next to it, we've got a symmetry menu. And there's different ways of creating symmetry, but I'm just going to show you one for today because it's the one you use most of the time, or I do anyway. And it's this one, it's mirror. It's the mirror symmetry tool. And it's very simple to use. I'm just going to click on it here. And what I need to do is create basically a symmetry line. It's like a plane around which both things happen, the same things happen on both sides of that symmetry plane. So I want my symmetry plane to be running along the midpoint of my box, okay? So I'm going to select a face on this side and then select a face on that side by clicking on them with my left mouse button. If I do that once, and then I click on this one, what we can see here is that Fusion has created this green line all the way around our box. That's a line of symmetry now, or an axis of symmetry. I'm just going to click OK if I'm happy with that. So now if I go and use my edit form tool, which if you remember is the one in the modify menu, edit form, or it's the same one up here, click on that. Now say if I click on this face, and if I start, let's start dragging this around, you can see the same thing happens on the other side of the form. So if you want to create a symmetrical object, it's very straightforward, obviously. What you do on one side is mirrored on the other side. And that can be a really useful function. So with the edit tool and the symmetry tool, there's a lot you can do just in a quite a quick period of time to start modifying your shape into something that might be recognizable. So we can do a number of things with the edit form tool. We can modify a face like so, but we can also modify a line. It doesn't have to be just a face, it can be a line like so. And you see that line's moving rather than the face, it's just a line that's being modified here. We can also just modify a point as well. So we can pull that point out and it's just that point that's being moved. It can be tricky to know when you're trying to create some kind of sculpture object, which is the best one to use, whether you want to modify a face, a line, or a point. And there's no right or wrong way, really, of doing it. It's really a case of playing and experimenting, in my experience, with the edit modifying tool to see what works and what doesn't work in what you're trying to achieve. There's no sort of set way, in my mind, of doing it. The other thing you can do, you don't just have to edit one face at a time. You can, or one line at a time, you can edit all of them or a selected number of them. So say I wanted to edit this face, and say this face, so these three faces. I select one, but then I can also hold down the Shift button on the keyboard. And whilst I've got that held down, I can select as many faces or as many lines, as many points as I like. And then that modifier tool will start to affect all of those faces. So now when I move that up, you can see it's not just this face that's being modified, but it's all of those faces are being modified. And it's at the point where the grey faces meets the blue faces, where the actual real stretching, if you like, or compressing occurs. And hopefully you can see that that's a relatively simple way of starting to, make a form which would be hard to make using, standard modeling tools that you find in Fusion. And we can play around with this really to our heart's content, and it's quite easy to get to something quite quickly, which might look something like a computer mouse, for instance. Bring this in, put a little undercut in there, select maybe this line, down. The whole thing's a bit too tall. So you can just sort of play around and grab the surfaces and just start sort of playing around till you start to get a shape which you like the look of, obviously. Let's see, I'm going to select this one and make this a bit more curved at the back. This out, so it's a bit more rounded. So to round something off, this was a flatter form. I've just grabbed the middle line in between those two faces, sort of pull those into a more circular, bulbous shape. Whereas if you can go in this direction and it goes more concave. But selecting the line there will do that. Whereas if I select, say, the faces here, that will just move the whole face backwards and forwards. I could try and select what's that point, and that would work. But then you're going to be making the whole thing rounder in that direction as well as that direction. So it depends what you want, obviously. But it's, as I say, it's a case of really playing around with the edit form tool and sort of familiarizing yourself with the different ways that it works, really. And I find it's quite fun. You can tinker to your heart's content, really, to get it just how you want it to be. Now, with Fusion, I think if you've used Fusion at all before, you will know that it kind of records in the normal design workspace every step that you do along the timeline down here. But you can see we're in the Sculpt environment, and the Sculpt environment is just represented by a single icon down here. What we don't have with the Sculpt environment is a sort of a record of every single time we edit before. It is literally more like a piece of clay. You can't go back in the same way that you can in the rest of Fusion. So once you've pushed something, you can't unpush it to a few steps ago through the timeline. However, we've got good old Control Z and Control Y, so the undo and redo functions, which are pretty common across a lot of programs. So we can undo and redo, your last however many, and I don't think there's a limit on how many you can actually do. You can go back and forward as much as you like. If you go to the edit form, the undo and redo menus up here, which is in the top left-hand corner, there's a drop-down menu of the last, say, 20 or so, but you can go back further than that if you wish. So that's really the way you can go backwards and forwards with things you've done in the past and things you want to redo that were done previously. So you can play around with it like that. So, so we've got the edit form tool, and that's really good for making blobby shapes. But not everything you want to create is going to be blobby. There's going to be angles and things that you might want to put into a sculpted shape. And it's quite useful at this stage to show you how to do that, because once you can put sort of sharp creases into things and curves, combined with the edit tool, you can kind of make pretty much any shape that you want, really, given enough time. So say, for instance, I wanted a crease around the bottom or a sharp edge around the bottom rather than this nicely smoothed edge. The way to go about doing that is in the modify tool, modify menu. And it's the crease function, which is about halfway down. And with anything in Fusion, if you hover over any particular menu option within Fusion, it gives you this rather useful little pop-up box of visual description what the function does. This one creates a sharp edge between faces, very simple. I'm going to click on that, and we get our crease dialog box popping up over here. And it's basically asking us which of these geometry lines we want to crease. Okay, and it has to be one of these lines that we've got here. So I'm just going to work my way around and click on those ones there. And if you remember, because we've got our symmetry line here, you just have to do it on one side and repeat that on the other side. I hope you're happy with that. Click OK. And it turns from being bright yellow back into the color we're working in. And you can see now we've got a creased line around our chosen vertices. So we can still modify this. You can still go back and click our edit form button. And we can start to modify this as well. So maybe that's a bit too wide. I want to bring it in. Maybe have it slightly underneath the form, like so. Maybe we want to have it up a bit. Maybe not. Maybe like it like that. So you can still modify these elements as well, as much as you like.
Ben, we've got a question from a participant who's asking about designing a car. Would you recommend using the Sculpt environment for that?
Definitely, yes, actually. I mean, obviously, I'm assuming you're asking about the body of a car. There's obviously lots of components that go into making a car. For the outside of the car, yes, definitely the Sculpt environment is the right thing to use. And there are some great resources on YouTube, particularly specifically about how to use the Sculpt environment in Fusion to design a car. And it's actually really, really good for car design. It's quite advanced, the kind of Sculpt tools that you're going to be using with that. So it's not somewhere I'm going to go in this workshop, certainly. But yes, definitely this is a good option if you want to design a car. And then, of course, if you want to put more mechanical functions into that car design, you can obviously use the normal design workspace to put in mechanical elements that, you know, things like suspension, or even if you wanted to model an engine or something like that. So you could design an entire car in Fusion if you wanted to, absolutely. But for now, we'll keep it a bit simpler and we'll go back to drawing this mouse. So you can see we're beginning to get to look like something that might look a bit like a mouse. And you can sort of play around and select as much of it as you like, bigger, smaller, wider, whatever you want to do, really. Just by playing around with all these different functions and seeing what works for you. And I would say the only way you can really understand the Sculpt environment is to start experimenting with it, really. What we'll do later on is I'll ask you to sort of make a box, a bit like this, and not necessarily make a mouse or a computer mouse, but you could do that. But just to start pushing and pulling and getting a feel for this particular function. And I will be on hand to sort of troubleshoot and understand where there are any problems coming along. But before I do that, I thought a couple of things I thought I'd show you is that how I've used this to make that vessel, that pinch pot, which I showed you earlier on, and also some real use case examples that we've done in the Fab Lab using the Sculpt function. So I'm just going to move over to the pinch pot form design. So just for reference, really, I've just placed a picture of the jug that was created, just so you can see the kind of thing that I was trying to achieve when modeling this form here. And you can see it's a reasonably complex shape. There's quite a lot sort of going on there in terms of the form. It's come up to a spout, but it's also pressed in towards the end. Then it's got a relatively flat bottom. Quite a nice form, really. And obviously we can just start playing around in the Sculpt environment. But often when you're designing things, you might start off with a sketchbook and some 2D sketches. And it's worth showing at this point is how you bring those 2D sketches into Fusion and start using those as references for your Sculpt form. And that's quite a useful way of actually transferring your ideas from a sketchbook onto a 3D platform like this. So I'm just going to do a new design and just show you how I go about doing that. So before I do that, what I did, I basically sketched this jug from 3 sides. So looking down from the top, sort of a straight down top view, looking from the side, straight on side view, and looking from the front. So we've got kind of, 3 sketches in what might be traditionally known as an orthographic projection, the front, top, and side views in drawing terms. And what we can do, we can bring those sketches into Fusion and use those as reference, as I say. So I'm just going to create a new design. And what we can do within Fusion, before we go into the create form function, we can insert a canvas, which basically means insert a picture. And for the gentleman who's asking about cars, you can see this is a way that you might take a car design from a sketchbook and start using that for reference when you're 3D modeling. So I'm going to click on canvas, and let's see, I've got them here somewhere. Here we go. So I'm just going to click on, I did these earlier, my drawings of my jug. And it's asking me where I want to put this sketch, what plane I want to put it on. So I'm going to put it on the side plane, the right plane, because this is the side sketch. Okay. So I'm going to click on that one. And I'm just going to zoom in a bit so we can see it. Okay, so it's kind of just a hand-drawn sketch of the side of my jug, just a very, low quality sketch. It doesn't have to be, a really beautifully drawn thing at all. And I'm just going to click OK. So we've got one sketch here. But now that's fine. We know what it might look like from the side, but we might also want to know what it looks like from the top and the front. So we've got all 3 sort of views all in one place. So I'm going to add another couple of sketches in by clicking on canvas. And I just wait for that to upload. And so I've done the side. Let's do the top. And this time I'm going to use the top plane and put this in on the top. Now we can see that's not coming the right way round. So we can just turn that round. So it's that way round. That makes sense. Click OK. So now we've got our side view. We've also got our top view. And this is really useful because they're intersecting each other like that. So we can start using those as reference material in a minute. And then the last one I'm going to put in is the front view. Now that's coming a little big, so I'm just going to reduce that like so. So we can see we've got something approaching, kind of like a wireframe of the shape we're trying to create. And this is just for guidance. So we've got something something to work from rather than just working, from our heads, which we can do, obviously. So I'm going to go into the create form of the Sculpt environment by clicking on the icon up here, the purple box. And I'm going to start trying to create this jug form. Where to begin? Well, we're going to begin with a primitive. And the primitive that I'm going to use in this case, I could use a number of them, but I'm going to use a cylinder because essentially this is a vessel, this is a hollow thing, and it's got a base to it. We can put that base in later. But the cylinder is kind of like the closest one, you see what I mean, to a hollowed object with an open side. So when you're selecting a primitive, you obviously want to choose the primitive, which is the closest one to the form you want to create. And sometimes it's not obvious and sometimes it is, but for anything that's hollow, a cylinder is a good place to start. I'm going to click on cylinder. And it's asking me where do I want to start drawing my cylinder. So I'm going to start drawing it on the top plane. So we're on the top plane here. I click on that, it will select the top plane. And I'm just going to drag out a cylinder approximately to the edge of my jug. So it's giving me this preview of this cylinder, but it's only doing it on one side. I want the cylinder to go from both sides because obviously there's a whole lot of stuff down here which needs to be modeled. So if you look in the cylinder dialog box here, we can choose a direction. We can do one side, or we can do a symmetrical cylinder. If I click on symmetrical, it will go both sides. It's the same with any other function you have in Fusion when it comes to extruding. And then I'm just going to reduce it in size. So it's approximately the right height. We're not trying to be really accurate here. And I'm just going to click OK. I think I'm happy with that. We may want to put in some more faces here. We may want more detail to get this form. Let's just try putting in 6 here just to give me just a bit more detail potential here. I'm going to click OK. So we've got something that looks nothing like a jug, but a lot like a cylinder. So now we need to start manipulating that to turn that into a jug. But before I do that, if we think about our jug, it's got a line of symmetry running through the middle of it. So it's important to put that symmetry in now. It will save us a lot of work later on. And obviously, the line of symmetry is essentially running along the y-axis along here, down the center line of that jug. So I'm going to put in the line of symmetry to make the modeling easier. I'm going to click on the symmetry button up here. I'm going to click on this face and then this face, to either side of where I want the symmetry line to be. So the symmetry line is now there and there, basically along that plane. That's where the symmetry line is. Okay. So now here comes the fun bit. We can start modeling. We can start pushing and pulling this cylinder around to start trying to get a jug form. So we're going to use the edit form tool, if you remember again. So let's see. Okay, I'm going to select perhaps these ones. And let's see, let's just start trying to pull into place what we want. And this is really where you have to spend quite some time, really, just sort of just taking your time and pulling everything that you want into place. And what we can do, probably the best way of doing this is if we look side on and we work around each of our views one by one. So if I click on the side view, and then we can just drag our form, not so it's exact, but so it's relatively close to the profile we're trying to achieve. So you can see I've just picked up lines and points and just used either the arrows or the side or the multi-directional move tool just to move those around. So we've got something approaching the sketch form that we have from the side view. And we can do the same again over here. Just drag that one over there. We just work our way around basically. Now that's gone completely wrong, we'll see. So I can play around with this. Bring this one over here. But you can see relatively easily, just by clicking on points and moving them around, we can start to get the kind of shape we're looking for just from the side profile. So we've got the sides or the end of the jug and the front of the jug. We also need to do the top. So let's bring that down somewhere like that. But it's not exact, but we can slowly manipulate this as we go forward. We're just going to try and get an approximation at this stage. So once we've done it from one side, if we turn it around, we can see, oh, well, that's good from one side, but it's not very good, say, from the top. So we'll go back and start modifying from the top view. And again, we could just pick up different points and start dragging. Often dragging points around is quite useful, or sometimes dragging lines around works. Points is a good place to start in my experience. And we can turn it around and also maybe print it a bit. And then finally, from the front view, we can see, hopefully we can just about make that front view around here. We can see, obviously, you're going to need to do some work here to start bringing it in to something closer to what we want. Moving around, just picking up on the points and mostly clicking on the point and then using this square tool in between the arrows to modify it to get somewhere to what we want. So there comes a point where you want to stop using those side views, top views, and front views, and just start working in 3 dimensions. And what we can do, we can have these canvases on, but if they're getting in the way, and at some point it all gets a bit difficult to look at, we can turn them off very easily. And if we look over here in our browser over here, as soon as we brought in those canvases, it created a canvas folder, and we've got jug side, jug top, and jug front. And if we want to, we can just turn them off and on all together, like so. I'm just going to turn them off for now, because then we can see the form a bit better, and we can start manipulating it without those getting in the way. So here we have the modify form again, and we can just start picking up different points within our shape and start moving them around, start making it go. And I think what you're often trying to do, as you sort of turn your model around, and just so you are aware, to turn your model around, everything is done on your mouse with the middle mouse wheel. So by zooming in and out, by rolling your middle mouse wheel in and out, you zoom in and out. And by holding it down and using it as a button, you can rotate around your object. And that's the simplest way of rotating and moving around. But if you see these lines here, they're not very smooth. They're kind of going in and out a bit. And what you want often, not always, but often what you want is kind of smooth curves. And that's what you're trying to achieve with these lines. So I might think, oh, well, that's not looking too nice there. It's looking a bit sort of awkward. So we can start to move those lines around. So this particular line here is a smoother line. Maybe something like that. Bring that one out a bit. Bring that one in. And if you work your way around and looking at these in different directions, if that line becomes smoother, then your whole object will become a little more smooth as well. Unless you want it to be obviously not smooth, but that's often a good way of working with Sculpt in Fusion, is to sort of use these lines as sort of a reference. Do I want it to be smooth here? Do I want it to be bulbous here? And you can work your way around. And it takes quite a while to end up with a pinch pot like the blue one I showed you over here. Have a look at this one. But hopefully you can see by lots of manipulating of that shape with that edit tool, in time you can get to a shape that you want. And it just takes a bit of sort of practice, really. But what we also need to do, say we were happy with this shape, and obviously it needs more work, but say we were happy with this shape. In fact, I'm really not happy with that. That's annoying me. Say we were happy with the shape. Well, obviously, we need to give it a bottom surface down here. It's obviously got a hole in the bottom. It wouldn't be much good for any kind of liquid. So we need to fill the hole. And to fill a hole, there's, believe it or not, a fill hole function in a modify menu. So if we go over to the modify menu up here, and about a third of the way down, we've got a fill hole function. And it's very straightforward. I'm just going to click on that. And this dialog box pops up, and it's basically asking, what's the hole you want to fill? Well, it's this one. So I'm just going to click on any of these lines around here. And if I click on one of those lines, it works out, oh, okay, that's the hole you want to fill. There's different ways that hole can be filled. You can, you've got different modes. You've got a collapse mode. You've got a fill star mode, and you've got a reduced mode. Entirely up to you. Whatever you like, basically. I'm going to go with this one. You can also, quite usefully here, you can put in a crease at this point, which you might want to do. I think I'll put in a crease at this point. I want a slightly more creased edge at the bottom of the pot. Okay, so we've now got something which is a surface. So this form has no actual thickness to it at all. So it's just like a piece of paper, if you like, or a piece of fabric. But if you obviously you might want to thicken up your pot and actually give it a thickness. And so within the modify function, again, we've got a thicken tool. So if you created a surface and you want to give that surface a thickness, we can use the thicken tool, which is about 3/4 of the way down. So if you click on that, and the thicken tool dialog box pops up, and it's asking, well, what do you want to thicken? So I'm going to click on, I've only got one form here in this particular design, so I'm going to click on this. Turns blue, so it's been selected. And what you can see here is there's a little dialog box here with 0 millimeters popping up, and it's asking us how thick you want your thicken to be. And we can give it a dimension here. Might be too much. 1 millimeter dimension. So, and it's giving us this preview of the thicken type, and we've got different ways of thickening. We've got a sharp way and a soft way, and what this does is will as it thickens it will either have a sharp edge to that thickness or have a curved edge. And I think I'll go for a curved edge on this one. And let's try that, see if it works. Okay, so you can see now, hopefully, this vessel has a thickness to it, and it also has a rounded edge where that thickness occurs. So we've used that soft function for thickening and the rounded edge. Okay, and that had a standard thickness in this case of 1 millimeter. So I must have done this very small. So also this is a very small pot, but that's beside the point at the moment. But we can still go back and edit this form. Okay, now we've done all of this, we can go back and modify this. And so if we want to change the thickness at any point, so some parts of this pot might be thicker and thinner. So that thickness tool only happens at that point. Now, if I edit this or modify, say, this surface here, you can see the whole wall gets a lot thicker here. So it doesn't maintain that thickness throughout the rest of your editing. You can just use it to thicken at that point and then go back and start playing around where you may want a thicker wall or you may want a thinner wall. So there we can see we've got something which looks something like, vaguely like the pinch pot that I designed earlier on. And I think those are the core sort of tools I wanted to show you as just as a way of starting off with the sculpt function. There's a lot to know about the sculpt environment, but the thing to do is get familiar really with how to create primitives, how to edit using the edit form tool. That's the really important one, really. And perhaps how to put creases into things, how to remove creases. Just to mention, if you want to crease things, you can, but if you want to uncrease things, you've got an uncrease tool as well. So it's very easy to crease things, and if you don't like it, go back and remove that crease. Perhaps how to fill holes and how to thicken things up. Those sort of the core sort of tools you need to sort of start playing around with to sort of get used to working with the sculpt environment. So say you've got to the point where you're happy with your sculpt form and you want to come out of the sculpt environment and maybe want to go into another part of Fusion, or you want to exit altogether and take this onto a 3D printer. Once you've finished all the editing that you want to do, we've got a finish form button up here, a big tick box. And if we tick on that, here we go. This is good. This is a good example of what can go wrong sometimes. It will try and turn it into a solid body. And sometimes you get a dialog box saying, actually, Fusion can't compute that. It's not actually physically possible. But what it has done is thrown up the area where it can't compute it, where it can't turn it into a body, which we could say take to a 3D printer, which is really helpful because it means we can then go back and modify that slightly into a form that it can convert into a body. So I'm just going to return to that effect. And we can see it's probably just got a really tight and thin at this point. It might even be overlapping slightly in this form. And that's something it can't have. It can't have an overlapping form. So let me just see if I can modify this. Oh yes, if we zoom in, you can see, hopefully, that we've got two surfaces overlapping slightly. So let's see if we can just remedy that. Put that out there for now. And let's see if we can finish that form. Okay, so now when I press finish form, that's worked. Okay, we are now back in our standard design workspace with all our familiar design tools that we have in Fusion. And we can start using those design tools on this form. We can start extruding into it, we can cut into it. It's a solid object in the way that any other solid object appears in Fusion. If we want to go back and edit this form, that's absolutely fine. We just go down to our form icon in the timeline, and if we right-click on that, we can edit it. And then we're back in the Sculpt form. And we can do that any time that we want to within the timeline. If there's things coming on afterwards, we've done other features to it, we can always go back and edit that form, and it will rebuild. So it's just like any other solid body within Fusion at this point. Before I move on, I'll just show you some use cases. I'll just quickly show you how to export this, so you can take it to a 3D printer or some other kind of, CNC machine or something like that. So let's take a 3D printer, for instance. What we need to do is export this out of Fusion as something called an STL, stereolithography file format. And the way to do that is it's kind of hidden within Fusion. It's not in the file menu. It's not in the export function where you might naturally think it would be. It's actually within the browser down here. And what we have to do, we have to go to the bodies folder within the browser. This is a body within Fusion. It was a modeling body. That's its terminology. And we need to open up that folder by clicking on that little triangle. And this is it. This is body 1. And off, turn it on. Okay. What I need to do is right-click on body 1 and save as STL. Again, I don't know why it's tucked in down there, but that's where it is. Okay. So we save that as an STL, and we get a dialog box popping up here. And the only thing I would say, when you save anything as an STL in Fusion, take to a 3D printer, is that we need to, the refinements might be at low, medium. I would always put it on high. You want as much detail as possible coming out of Fusion and onto a 3D printer. So you can send it directly to a 3D print utility. So say you have a 3D slicer already installed on your computer, and it's already linked to Fusion, you can directly do it this way by clicking on that. And they're the ones I've got installed. But if you don't have that, you just click OK and save it somewhere on your computer. Pop it on the desktop, wherever you want, and call it whatever you like. And that will be then saved as an STL file, which you can then take to a 3D slicer like Jewellery or freeform or whatever you use for 3D printing. So it's quite easy to create a sculpt form quite quickly, take it to the point where you might want to 3D print it. And before we take a break, I thought it might be worth just showing you a couple of things that we've done in the lab over the last year or two, perhaps using the form function. And let's have a look at the first one. This is from a student, must have been about 18 months ago or so, and she was a jeweler. And she came to us and she wanted to make a brooch in the form of a chrysalis, so a moth, a particular moth chrysalis, and I forget what type of moth it was. But she came to us with basically photographs of the chrysalis, and she'd done a really good job. She had photographed it from the side and the front and from different angles. So in just the same way we work with the pinch part, we were able to bring those photographs into Fusion, start using that as a sort of a starting point to start trying to model this shape. And you can see it's quite a sort of amorphous blobby shape. It would be hard to model that using the other functions within Fusion, obviously, but it's really quite straightforward with the sculpt functions. And as you can see, it's got a line of symmetry running along the middle like so. So quite similar in some ways to that pinch pot. And I think if I remember rightly, we just started off with a ball and started pulling that ball in different directions. So we got to the point where we had this outer shape, but then we were also able to put in these other shapes, which were part of the chrysalis, these kind of little sort of blobs, for want of a better word, these other features that were in that sort of chrysalis that was trying to replicate. And again, we used the sculpt function to bring in a primitive, and you can merge things together, create one shape. Once that was done and we created that shape, we then took it back into the design workspace. And then we could start doing all these sort of slightly more mechanical things were required to make this brooch. And the idea was that this brooch, or sorry, it wasn't a brooch, it was a pendant hanging from a necklace, would have a crystal in it, and this crystal would lock the two halves of this chrysalis together. So if I just take that crystal out, we can see inside we modeled sort of like the hexagonal holders of this crystal, and we split the chrysalis into two halves. And the idea was you would bring these two halves together and put the crystal in, and it would all lock together. You could hang it around your neck as a piece of jewellery. And the idea was that this was then cast in silver and to work with the pre-existing crystal that the student already had. So, relatively complex in some ways, but working through the steps that you've seen with the sculpts, and perhaps steps you might have seen with just basic extrusion functions within Fusion to create these kind of hexagonal shapes, which were then linked to the outer form of the sculpt. It looks complex, but actually it wasn't really particularly complex, I'd say. And the output from this was we were able to print this piece, so these pieces, using one of our resin printers in a castable wax. And that's a type of wax which can then go down to the jewellery maker's foundry and be cast in this case, silver. So it was made. And so that whole process sort of occurred, starting off with some pictures from a sketchbook and photographs, coming into Fusion, modeling it, designing it, and then 3D printing essentially a mould or a tool for a mould to actually create the piece of jewellery in the end. So it's quite a nice example of how you can use Sculpt for this. And I've got one other thing to show you, which is completely different, but it shows you a whole other way you could use Sculpt. And it's quite relevant for these times at the moment. So this is an NMA. This is a medical device that we were working with for a company. We work with all sorts of companies at the Fab Lab, and we were working on this laryngeal mask airway. And this is if you get COVID or end up in hospital, this is the thing they'll shove down your throat to ventilate you. Really unpleasant experience, and you're unconscious when this happens, and you're sedated. But basically, this is connected to airways, and you're ventilated through this tube, and this is the bit that goes into your throat and is pumped up to push your airways open to keep your airways clear, and you can breathe. But the reason I'm showing it to you is because we used the sculpt function within Fusion to create this shape here. Now, this is actually quite a complex shape in some ways to create using the other functions within Fusion, but it's actually a really simple shape to create in the sculpt function, and it was created perhaps in a few seconds. So this is where it's useful from a point of view of productivity and doing things quickly and efficiently. And if I go into the sculpt environments, you can see how quick it is to do it. If I click on the torus function, you can see how similar, hopefully, that sort of circular shape is to this kind of egg shape. And if I create a torus shape down here, just next to it, so you can see. And perhaps I give it some symmetry and then edit it. You can hopefully see. Select all sides of this. Let's just grab it. Select all sides of these. You can just start filling that out very quickly into a shape that looks a bit like that. You can see how quickly you can do that. Whereas if you were to try and do that using some of the other functions of Fusion, you might be there 10 or 15 minutes trying to create that kind of shape. But it's got different applications, is basically what I'm saying. You can use it for very sculptural, ergonomic, organic shapes. But you can also use it in product design for for just doing things quickly, which you can't do easily in another way. I've waffled on now for almost an hour and a bit, so perhaps we should take a few minutes break, and perhaps after that everyone can have a go at just playing around with it, and we can start having a go, perhaps doing a simple sort of box exercise together. So I don't know if everyone's back yet, but it might be worth just if there's any questions about what I've showed you, and if there's anything anyone wants me to go over again, or any, and then we can move on to more general questions, I guess, after that. That makes sense.
Yeah. Just looking at the questions from the start, Ben, there was one we didn't answer. I think it was around the planes. Once you've selected a plane, can you change it?
So selecting a plane for to draw your original box on. I'm just trying to find that.
Yeah, that was when you were working on the box.
So no, once you've selected that plane, you can't change it. So if you decide you don't want it on that plane, the best thing to do is just delete that body and start again and choose the plane you want to work.
What I'm really interested in is doing my own prototype, like sculpting a form, and then transferring the image onto this system for reproducing. And it sounds like you can do that with a combination of sketching and photographic images.
Yeah, absolutely. So you've got a sculpture, a pre-existing sculpture which you've got drawings or images of, and you want to reproduce it. So am I right in thinking?
Well, I haven't actually got a sketch of it. I just did it from my hands, but okay. That would be an example of something I've modeled myself, and I'd like to be able to reproduce it in a ceramic, possibly, because the prototype was done in air-dried clay. It wasn't done in a kiln, but obviously, it gets harder over the years. But I just thought I've got a few forms, sculptural forms, and it would be nice if I could reproduce them in another material, or perhaps in ceramic. And I just wondered about the scanning as well, because that's obviously linked in, because instead of doing a photograph, sometimes you can just scan a 3D object, can't you, in the Fab Lab?
You certainly can, absolutely. So I should imagine we'll have some more 3D scanning workshops, so you haven't been on one before, where you can find out all about that. You've got two options basically there. You can either do a bit like what we've done, and I've shown you with the pinch spot. You could take your existing object and photograph it from different sides, and use that as a way of modeling it from scratch within Fusion. That would be good to do if you want to change your form in some way, or modify it, or edit it without having to remake it. And it's also quite useful if you want to perhaps make molds rather than actually just 3D print it, which is something else that Fusion can do particularly well. Is you design your actual thing and then make a mold from it, which is good for slip casting. So you've got that option this way. The other option is simply just to 3D scan it, and then you'll have a different type of CAD model, which again can be reproduced on a 3D printer, and again molds can be made from that. I guess it's two different approaches, really, and which one's right for you?
I think it's nice having the two possibilities, because it's like trying to get a combination of keeping some of the imperfections from the original prototype, but being able to reproduce them in an effective way.
Okay, so if there's imperfections you want to try and keep, then it might be scanning is the best option, because trying to remodel those imperfections from scratch is, well, A, it might be quite tricky, and B, it's not really in keeping with what we're trying to do. So scanning for that one might be the best option.
Unless you're, as you say, you could do a mould, and then obviously it would be reproduced within the mould, wouldn't it, if you were doing ceramics?
Yes, absolutely. So you could scan the object and you could turn that into a slip casting mould. You can take that scanned object, if you like, and within Fusion or another piece of software similar, maybe something like Mesh Mixer, you can modify it in any way you want to. But Fusion is quite good for this, and then you can basically use that scan and essentially create, you know, like a female two-part mold on that object, which can obviously then be used to slip cast if you're wanting to slip cast. I'm not sure what kind of process you want to use.
But the other thing is that you can also change the scale of the prototype, can't you? Because you can enlarge it if you want.
Certainly can. That's something that's very easy to do with this kind of thing. You can scale things up very simply. That's true.
Yeah, which I find very exciting, because obviously my models are very small, really. Well, they're hand built, hand size, but you could improve the size and the shape. You can. There's so many things you can do. It's really fantastic, I think. Thank you very much.
What we can do now, if you want, if we have got some people with Fusion, it would be a good time to have a go right now, if you can, with it. And then if you are having any problems, potentially you can share screens and we can sort of troubleshoot any issues you're having just with, you know, the very early stages of using the Sculpt function. Sometimes it's easy to click the wrong thing, or, you know, and get a bit lost. So just those first few times you use it. So if anyone does have Fusion loaded onto their computers and want to use it, now would be a good time. And if you do, what I suggest you do is something along the lines of the sort of the mousy shape that I did earlier on, because it's a nice simple one to start exploring and playing around with. Other than that, we can carry on with the general discussions and Q&A.
Yeah, Ben, before we do that, could you, we've had a question from Eman asking about how you sort of filled the bottom of the jug. So could you go again into the modify and the fill hole function?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's do that. In fact, what I'll do is I'll do another one of these jugs quite quickly and just show you how to fill a hole again, rather than try and go back and find that point which I did that. So let's create another one over here. So let's put a bit of symmetry in, so we get something like it was before. Having the wrong thing here. Okay. So we've got something beginning to look jug shaped like that. What we need to do is obviously fill this hole down here. So you come out of the edit form, okay, you finish the edit form, and then we go to the modify menu. So create, modify, and then about a third of the way down, we've got the fill hole function, okay, fill hole. If you click on that, and then we need to tell Fusion which hole we want to fill, because at the moment there's two. There's one at the top and there's one at the bottom. And so we're going to fill the one at the bottom. And all you need to do is just click on one of these, not all of them, just one of the edges of these spaces, which are on the edge of that hole, if you like. So I'm just going to select one of them. And then we've got fill hole mode, and there's different ways we can fill this hole. As I said before, we can do, and it just creates different faces. or different surfaces which you might want to manipulate later on. And you can have one which is a filled star in this case, or a collapse, which kind of makes radial faces. And we can also either have a crease that hole, or we can not. It's entirely up to you, just by ticking that on there. And that's all there is to it. And now you've got a filled jug. I don't know if anyone is deciding to have a go with Fusion 360. I can also, and please do let me know if that's not something you want to do, because I could also show you how to potentially make molds at this stage from a sculpt form like we've created, which might be useful potentially. Perhaps let me know in the chat if anyone's interested in seeing that.
Yeah, we've got a question from Catherine. So can you use the different parts of the jug and put it out in the normal Fusion instead of the sort of Sculpt environment?
So yes and no. You can't work in a sculptural way within the standard workspace within Fusion. So let's just show that actually. Let's just give this a quick thickness and turn that into something like this. So if I go back into Fusion here, and let's just turn this one off and have a look at this one. We can't start editing and modifying it in the normal design workspace. There is something within Fusion known as direct modeling, and there's a press pull function, but it's not really suited to sculptural form. So I don't think it would work if we tried to do this in any way. Expand it, we can contract it, we can make it a bit bigger, we can make it a bit smaller. But if we want to sculpt something, we need to go back into the sculpt environment to do that. Yes, you can't do that in the workspace. That's what we're trying to say.
Yeah, you can add different components to it though within the normal sort of Fusion environment.
Absolutely. So, say for instance, like a handle. So let's put a handle in so I can show you that. Like that. So, for instance, we can start to model in a handle quite easily using the standard Fusion methods of 2D sketching followed by a three-dimensional feature. So, say something like this. So we have kind of handle. P. So all I'm going to do here is that. So we can then use our extrude function here. And then we can extrude out a handle. And this will merge then with what we've already got. So we've now got a handle, and now this is one solid object, so it's not separate. It's a merged handle, so we can put a handle in, and we can, do the things we might do normally within Fusion, like pop some fillets in, like that, and you can make something that looks like a. So very simply, we can start using those extrude functions. We can cut things into it, and we can extrude out from it, and just stick stuff on and put a handle in very simply. I think people are saying yes to seeing mold making, so I might share that in a minute. And Eman, you're trying to make something like a human. Well, that's quite ambitious, but not impossible with the sculpt function. Yeah, you can. There's no reason you can't start trying to mold a sculpt form into the shape of a human. You can make any shape that you want. I'm just trying to think of a simpler way of doing that, perhaps. You might, obviously, you can have photographs in the same way of, you know, person standing from the front, the side, and the top. You could also find pre-existing sort of models of humans. So there's big CAD libraries out there, online libraries, where you can download models for free. So if you want a human, even if you want to make your own human, it might be useful to have that model in your workspace as a template to start working from, or just as reference. I think often the hardest thing is when you're presented with a blank screen and it's difficult to know where to start. So if you look at online CAD libraries, and there's things like GrabCAD, grabcad.com, which is a big online library of CAD models, and you just sign up, it's all free, and you can just type in what you're searching for, and there'll be thousands of examples of what you're looking for, and you can download them and import them into Fusion and use those perhaps as a starting point for you know, modeling a human. But yeah, that's quite an ambitious one to start off with. Let's see if there's any other questions we're going to. So injection molding, looking at molding process for injection molding, that's getting a little bit more specific when it comes to injection molding. I'll just show you how in this example about how you can take a form, sort of the tool form, if you like, of a mold and turn it into the two-part mold. With injection molding, it's a bit more specific because you've got to have certain draft angles so things release nicely, and you also need to have screws in place for allowing the actual plastic to go in from certain points. It's certainly very doable, and in fact, Fusion's pretty good for injection molding modeling. But I'll just show you the basics of how you turn essentially an object into a mold in a minute. So I'm just going to get something set up ready for molding. In Sculpt, when filling the bottom hole, you can get a pie and different slices. Yes, you can. That's right. There's different ways of filling that hole, so it does look like a pie and slices, but there's different options as well. No, that's right. No, so once you come out of the Sculpt environment and you come back into the design workspace, all those faces that you see within the Sculpt environment disappear because you can't modify them outside the Sculpt environment. So they remove them, so they're not, you know, interfering with the shape of the form. So you'll only see those in the Sculpt environment. Understood the question now. Right, so let's just here and create something to make a mold from. Briefly, not too long. So we'll just do a really simple jug form just for now. Like that. Take this side. So let's just go with something like this for a jug. And what I'm going to do to make this mold, I'm going to fill the bottom, but in this case, I'm going to fill the top as well, because obviously we're doing some kind of slip casted mold. That's what you're going to need. So I'm just going to fill the top and the bottom. And so the top as well. So say with this was the shape we were going to turn into a two-part mold. So this is the shape that we've got. This is our solid body. So what we need to do to create our two-part mold is we need to actually draw the mold itself, if you like, or the outer form of the mold. And so to do this, I'm just going to extrude a couple of rectangles either side of the jug, and then we can use something called the combine function, which you can also use to intersect and to sort of make that mold. So I'll just show you, it's probably simpler. So what I'm going to do, once we've got our object we want to make a mold from, I'm going to basically just draw a rectangle around it, like so. And we can see that rectangle is exactly on that midpoint. So this is the point where it's the split point in your mold, if you like. And from that, I'm just going to extrude it this way, deeper than the object itself. Now, at this point, Fusion is thinking we want to cut away that jug form, but we don't want to do that. What we want to do at this point, we want to create a new body, okay? So this is a secondary body. We're not joining it to the jug form. We're just creating a new body, and they kind of overlap. I'm just going to click OK there. So we've got our jug fitting inside this rectangular block. But what we need to do is tell Fusion is to remove the area that this jug exists in, if you like, inside that block. Now I'm just going to make this a different color so we can see it a bit better. Just make this one green, this one red. Okay. So under the modify menu, I've got a combine tool, but this combine tool can also intersect as well, or cut away, and we're going to use the cut function. I'm going to click on combine, and this is the dialog box over here, and it's asking us two things. What's the target? What are we trying to cut into, and what tool are we using to cut into? So the target body is this rectangle here. This would be the mold form. And the tool body is the jug itself. Then it's asking us, what do we want to do? We can either join it at this stage, we can intersect it, or we can cut it. We want to use the jug tool to cut into that mold. So I'm going to click on cut. And I'm also going to click on keep tools. If I don't click on that, it's going to remove my jug altogether. I want to keep the jug, but I also want the mold. So I'm going to click on keep tools and click OK. And hey presto, it looks like nothing's happened. But now if I turn this jug off, or just hide it for a minute, and to do that I go over to my bodies folder, open it up if it's not open, and just turn off body one. And now you can see you've got that pressed in form into that mold, And obviously, because this is a symmetrical object, we can just mirror this one over. But obviously with mold making, you obviously usually need some kind of reference holes and bosses to align those two molds. So it would be a good idea to put those in now. So I'm just going to show you how to do that. It's really useful to know. And I'm just going to put a couple in, so you can put in as many as you like. 3 would be a good idea. Okay, one over here, and one over here. And just going to do a little segment like that. And I'll show you why I'm doing this in just a moment. So what I'm going to do with these is just revolve these into a semicircle. And you grab that and the axis and join. And this is the kind of thing you need to do so that we can do the opposite of that into the other side of the mold, if that makes sense. And obviously we could do the other one on the other side. I'll just do one for now. So if we turn this one back on, and I'm just going to create another sketch here. And what I'm going to do is do the other side of the form. Bring it out here somewhere like that. And again, I'm going to create a new body. If I just turn off my my back part of the mold here, we're doing the same thing again. We're going to combine, and we're going to target body this, tool body that, cut. We've got the other side. We'll turn off my jug now. Again, we've got the other side. Oops, sorry. And now we've got our two molds. The only other thing we need to do now is where we've got our little boss here, our registration boss, we need to push that into the other side of the mold. So the two molds line up, and obviously you'd have more of these, but I'll be showing you one for an example. And again, we're going to use the combine tool. This is the target body. This is the tool body. We're going to cut again, keep tools. And now if I turn this one off, you can see that cutaway, that recess would line up. And so if you had a number of these dotted around here, those two molds would line up perfectly. And then the last thing you might need to do is obviously some kind of hole into which you would put your material, depending on your molding process. Something like that. So, I mean, you can obviously go into a lot more detail with molding, but that's the core, the basics of how to take a form or a tool within Fusion and basically get the reverse function of it, the reverse object, that molded object. It's a pretty straightforward process. So it's a case of drawing your mold body and using the combine tool. The combine tool also cuts and intersects things as well, and using the geometry we've already created in the Sculpt environment to cut into that mold form and do that both sides. So that's a very whistle-stop tour of how you create molds from a form. Louise, what about engraving the pattern that is 2D? Okay, so when you mean engraving the pattern that is 2D, so what you can do, you can draw a 2D sketch over on any flat surface in Fusion and engrave with that or push into that by doing the extrude cut function, if that's what you mean. I don't know, that's maybe, I don't know if you did the Fusion 3D introduction part 2, because that kind of extrude cut would be in there, I would have thought.
Following up on that, we've got a question from Emin who wants to change the colors. So that's the sort of the basic color you get, but you can change that. So I don't know if Ben, you want to go through it.
Yeah, that's a pretty simple thing actually. There's a lot you can do to change the appearance of stuff in Fusion, but I'll just give a brief overview. In the modify menu, we've got appearance, and it's right near towards the bottom, or it's A on your keyboard. So if I click on that, there's huge amounts of appearances or materials you can apply to bodies and components within Fusion. And there's a big library that's already in there. So fabrics, glass, leather, cloth, metals, paints, plastics, it goes on. But if you just want to change the color, I would suggest you go to the paint section, and then there's different effects of color, so glossy, for instance, and you just choose the one you want. And it's simply a case of dragging and dropping onto the body you want to change the color of. So say, for instance, this was the yellow, drag that onto that, and it turns yellow. If the exact color isn't there that you want, we can edit that. So we can see once you drag that yellow paint onto this body, it appears up here, and these are the different colors I've used in this design. And if I right click on one of these, say the yellow one, I can edit it. And then say if yellow is not exactly what you want, you can play around with these kind of sliders and turn it into whatever color you want pretty easily. And there's a lot more I could talk about with the appearances within Fusion, but that's probably a whole nother workshop, a rendering workshop, which I think we've got some rendering workshops planned. But very quickly, that's how you basically change the color. And once you've changed it to something like green, you might be better off just changing the name as well, or whatever, so you don't get confused. What I do all the time. So now that will update, and that is paint enamel glossy aqua. So just to reiterate, it's in the modify section under appearance, and then you basically open up these little folders and they've got all the different appearances in them. Just to say, I'm just trying to find an example at the moment. If I can find an example. Sometimes you have to download some of these. Trying to see if one. So if you see this little sign next to these appearances, that means they haven't been downloaded to your computer and they won't work. But all you need to do, if you do want to use one of these, is just click on the download button next to it, and then it will be downloaded to the library locally on your computer, and then you can turn it, you can drag and drop it. So now it's sort of quite a nice fabric red one. So hopefully it's pretty straightforward. You can also work just on faces, so you can color the whole thing in, or you can just work on a face. So if I click on faces up here, and then I can just drag and drop onto any particular face that I want to as well. Martin, how do I delete the entire thing? Well, there's a number of ways you can delete stuff in Fusion, but say you've got this, and you can just hide things, which is sometimes just a good thing to do, is just to hide things by turning them off and on, so to get them out of the way. But if you do want to delete stuff, and say it's a body, so say I want to delete this red body here, you need to go to the body menu, find the body you want, you right click, you can delete or remove. Okay, but I would avoid deleting things unless you really want to, because as you say, you get this warning saying it's referenced by other things, so other features have used some of this geometry. So I would suggest, rather than deleting things, the better option is to remove it, and then you've always got the option later, if you want to get it back, to unremove it, if you see what I mean. And that's probably a better thing to do than deleting things.
Yeah, thank you. I was more thinking that just experimenting, playing with a program which I've only just downloaded, and you make a sort of complete messy object. You want to get rid of the whole thing at the end. How do you actually just? Yeah. How do you get rid of it?
Yeah, absolutely. You can delete it. Obviously, you can, once you've done anything and it appears in your menu, your control panel over here. You can also delete entire files as well, just by right-clicking on them and deleting them all together. So yeah, that's the other way of doing it, really.
I'm working on a Mac Airbook, so I can't left and right click very easily. I'm not used to the machine either. So I need to expect to be with both.
Yeah. What I would suggest, if you are going to play around with Fusion, is do use a mouse. It's quite tricky to use Fusion with a trackpad. It's not impossible by any means, but you're making life hard for yourself.
Yes, I think I'll order myself a mouse for this machine.
Yeah, and if you do get a Mac mouse, you can actually change in the settings so it does actually have a left and right click.
Right.
So there is functionality there with Macs that have a left and right click.
But that's been really good. Thank you very much.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Ben, for that. I think that was really clear, and we've been receiving a few thanks from participants. So if you don't have any other questions, we'll wrap up the session for today.